Good morning. Thank you for having us here. And Kate, thank you for a lovely opening. That really is wonderful. Can you guys hear me if I stand over here? I didn't get dressed for you to not see my shoes. I'm not standing behind the podium. Takes a lot of effort, and it's not worth being behind the podium. So anyway, Kate actually, as part of the first story, which is fascinating to me, when I start this program, one of the things I ask the audience is to imagine yourself as a 7-year-old child growing up, where your caregiver and protector is also your abuser. And I asked the audience to think about that, exactly for what Kate was talking about, is that unless you live in that child's shoes, we wouldn't know what it's like. And the problem is, as we begin our journey together in terms of learning this today, many times we sit in our offices creating wonderful interventions based on our world that we impose on the world of that child. And we wonder why they're non-compliant. We wonder why they don't want to follow our good intentions. It's because sometimes there's a disconnection between what we believe in our world and the world of that child. Part of what we do, which is already something that is very clearly achieved already in this community, is to bring different service systems together, to understand that trauma really is the foundation and framework of what it is that we do. Because if you imagine a child who may end up in child protective services, may end up with in juvenile justice, may end up in mental health, maybe in residential program, substance use co-occurring, may end up in corrections, may end up with law enforcement encounter. We all are serving the same people. And what we have found, and part of the reason why we really feel passionate about trauma-informed care, is what we have found is that when we do not address the issue of trauma and the effects of trauma within a service system, we band-aid folks and they graduate on to the next service system. That's why we really are here to help understand. Hopefully this is not a flavor of the month for you. This is to help understand that if you understand trauma and the effects of trauma on the people we serve, we get to the root of the problem. How many times have we been in programs where we hear people say, this person has schizophrenia, this person is schizoaffective, this person may have personality disorders, oh, by the way, they have trauma. It used to be a sidebar. What we have learned is that unless you address the issues of trauma as a foundation of the work you do, regardless of where you are in the human service systems, it just becomes a Band-Aid. A little bit about who I am. I am Raul Almazar. I am actually, we are part of SAMHSA, but we're also part of the National Association of State Mental Health Program Directors. So just a quick plug on this. We are funded not only by promoting alternatives to seclusion and restraints to trauma-informed practices, but also the National Center for Trauma-Informed Care. And we do provide free technical assistance to any service system in any community, so that if at the end of today you think to yourself, I would love this to come to my program, we can give you the contact information and we can come to you. The issue of how did I get here? I started this work several years ago. I was running a 400-bed forensic facility in Illinois. I'm from Chicago. And we got a grant to reduce the use of seclusion and restraints. And after 3 years, we were able to reduce the use of seclusion and restraints by 65%. The length of time people stayed in seclusion and restraints by 99%. So we were pretty successful. So what happened was, as a result of that, I got asked to go to different service systems, to different hospitals, and help other places reduce the use of seclusion and restraints. So the next iteration of the work for me was, it became clear that the work I was doing was not about reducing seclusion and restraints. It was about changing organizational cultures, and especially taking on the culture of violence in a lot of programs. A lot of programs, when there's any kind of crisis, force is the first thing that gets used. So it became organizational culture change to take on the use of force. As a result of that, I became the Deputy Director for Mental Health for the state of Illinois, with a charge to take over 10 state hospitals and change the organizational culture of 10 state hospitals. Easy work. I lasted a few years. But in the course of that work, what became clear is that we cannot take on the issue of violence and change cultures of organizations unless we understand the effects of trauma and how trauma is in the root cause of a lot of the violence we see. And that's how I ended up in the trauma-informed care practice. So I'm so lucky I do this full time. We are in every service system, in corrections, I'm in juvenile justice, we're in homeless shelters, we're in every one of your service systems, helping each service system understand how trauma manifests itself in each service system. So I do this full time. So, point of clarification, I am not the guy from the movie The Hangover. I'm sure some of you have already thought that. So let's jump into this and begin to understand what it is we're talking about. When we're talking about trauma, some of you may even do trauma assessments, trauma screening, or trauma questionnaires in your programs. So this is your pretty typical definition of trauma. There are a few things I want to point out in this definition. One is neglect. Neglect is a passive event. One of the things that's really hard when you ask people, do you have trauma? Some people may not be able to say to you, I was neglected. It's not necessarily an active event that people can identify. So you may not be able to capture those folks. Another group of individuals you may not be able to capture. We've asked a lot of people with trauma, and they say, what trauma? I thought everyone grew up like that. I thought that's life. Those folks may not be able to give you a positive answer. Witnessing. A lot of people will not view witnessing as traumatic, but in fact, any of you work with veterans? Okay, so those of you who work with veterans, we're hearing more and more witnessing in the battlefield is actually worse. The other part of this is what is the definition of trauma, which is that it's any event that completely overwhelms the person's ability to cope. So that two individuals may be in the same car accident, one comes out okay, the other is not, because the events are all individually experienced based on our history. So one of the take-homes based on this is we cannot compare people's traumas. We cannot, you probably heard people say, I don't know what she's crying about. She should hear what happened to her roommate. We cannot compare people's traumas because we don't know what completely overwhelms the individual. There are many different types of trauma. The kind of trauma that we tend to talk about, and we will talk about today, is complex or developmental trauma. Trauma that tends to happen early in life and may continue over to adulthood. I love what Damon started with in terms of asking about the trauma in the community, because in any community we go into, one of the things I ask the community is, do you have historical trauma? Because wherever you are in the community, it is important to understand historical trauma in the community, because trauma changes people's views of the world, and that view of the world can get passed on from generation to generation. That if you don't work within that context, it's easy to label some behaviors or ideas as pathological when it could have come out of historical trauma and may just have been passed on from folks. Example I use for this, I had the opportunity of being asked last year to train all of the islands in Hawaii. I have a rough life. But before I got there, they said to me, Raul, you cannot train in Hawaii unless you understand our culture. All I knew about Hawaii was what I read and seen the movies. I didn't realize that they are still upset about us taking over their land. There are still bumper stickers in Hawaii that say, "Bring back the monarchy." We took over the land in the 1800s. And when I was going there, they said to me, "You cannot come here and train wearing a necktie." They said, if you wear a necktie when you train in Hawaii, you're automatically associated with mainland and you get written off. We took over in the 1800s, and that view of the mainland has been passed on from generation to generation. That if you don't understand that historical piece, you're operating without context. Another example of this, I have a friend who is a psychologist in Alaska, and he practices what he calls frontier psychology, which I think means he's the only psychologist in so many miles. He's working in a female juvenile detention program, and he said he's working with this one girl whose issue is self-esteem, and her self-esteem issues arise out of not knowing what's wrong with her because all of her friends are being sexually molested and she's not. Think of how the culture gets to evolve around these issues. And if you practice without understanding that, then you're practicing in a vacuum. So when we talk about trauma, make sure you understand historical trauma in your community as well as intergenerational trauma. Another example of historical trauma, which we will talk a little bit more this afternoon, is around organizational trauma. How many of you may have sat in organizational meetings where someone has a great idea and the response you get is, "We can't do that. Remember what happened 2 years ago?" That's organizational trauma. That's a trauma-based response within an organization. So think about, when we talk about historical trauma, we're not just talking about the larger community, we're also talking about, are you aware of the traumas within the smaller communities? So what happens with traumatic events is that it renders victims helpless by overwhelming force. It involves threats to life and bodily integrity or close personal encounter with violence and death. It disrupts a sense of control, connection, and meaning. It confronts human beings with extremities of helplessness and terror, and it evokes responses of catastrophe. The piece I want to point out here is the whole piece around loss of connectedness. A lot of trauma occurs within relationships, and healing also occurs within relationships. So that wherever you are in the human service system, whether you're working the front desk of a community mental health center, you're in law enforcement, you're a probation officer, when you establish connection with the people you serve, you're trauma-informed. You're already doing this work. You're already beginning the healing process because trauma disrupts connections, and wherever you establish connections, that's already trauma work. We'll do a little bit of statistics just in case you're not bored yet. I'll run through this because I think, how many of you, by show of hands, would say that the majority of people in your system have history of trauma? Okay, so I don't need to convince you. So we'll go through this pretty quickly. We understand 90% of public mental health clients have been exposed to trauma. In adults, 97% of homeless women with serious mental illness have experienced severe physical and sexual abuse. 87% experience this abuse both in childhood and adulthood. How many of you deal with individuals with the diagnosis of borderline personality disorder? Lots. Okay. Individuals diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, about 81%, and those with dissociative disorders, 90%, were sexually or physically abused as children. Dr. John Breer, out of the National Child Trauma Stress Network, actually talks about you'll be hard-pressed to find anyone with a diagnosis of borderline personality disorder who does not have a history of trauma, and that he really believes that that diagnosis does not exist, that actually those are trauma symptoms that you see in those individuals. In children and adolescents, American study of 100 adolescent inpatients, 93% had trauma histories, 32% had PTSD. Notice the significance in the difference. Not everyone who has trauma develops PTSD, so if your work is primarily focused on PTSD, you're missing a lot of folks. so that not everyone develops PTSD, but everyone who has history of trauma has effects later in life from that trauma. These are new statistics coming out of the National Child Abuse. More than 5 children die every day as a result of child abuse. Approximately 80% of children that die are under the age of 4. More than 90% of juvenile sexual abuse victims know their perpetrator in some way. About 30% of abused and neglected children will later abuse their own children. 14% of men and 30% of all women in prison were abused as children. Children who experience child abuse and neglect are 59% more likely to be arrested as a juvenile, 28% more likely to be arrested as an adult, and 30% more likely to commit violent crime. And children whose parents abuse alcohol and other drugs are 3 times more likely to be abused and 4 times more likely to be neglected. In 2010, they got over 3 million reports of child abuse and neglect in the country. That's the cohort that they studied this from, and processed about 2 million. So when we're talking about child abuse and neglect, we think historically of what we know in terms of physical, sexual abuse, and all of that. This is the piece that was completely surprising to me. Of those 2 million plus that they processed, 78.3% was from neglect. Neglect is one of those social ills we don't pay as much attention to. And one of the things we'll talk about today is the significant effect of neglect on brain development. And that brain development, how does that manifest itself in any service system people are in? I'll jump through this other. So we have statistics basically in all settings that there's a lot of trauma. So we already agree that the majority of individuals in our human service systems have history of trauma. The second bullet point is important, that there appears to be a strong relationship between victimization and later offending. Dr. Sandra Bloom coined the term, hurt people, hurt people. Hurt people, hurt people. Not everyone, but there's a large number. So that wherever you are in the human service system, this is not just about understanding trauma-informed care. This is about a moral, ethical obligation to help stop the cycle of violence. It's about helping identify. You could be a receptionist in the front office and you watch an interaction between a parent and a child and you see that may be questionable, that you have an opportunity and obligation to raise your voice and say, I watched something. Because we all have an obligation to help stop that cycle of violence. So what do we recommend? So when we talk about, when you ask people if they have trauma, or you do trauma screening and assessment, you may not capture those with neglect, you may not capture those who witness, you may not capture people who don't think that their life was traumatic. Individuals whose trauma occur before they have language will not have language to attach to that trauma. You may not be able to capture that. So what we recommend is practice universal precautions. Just assume everyone you encounter in the human service system have a history of trauma. Because if you do that, you become a trauma-informed system of care. The people who don't have trauma will not be hurt, but the people who have trauma will not be re-traumatized within your system. So universal precautions, how many of you have gloves at work? Rubber gloves, okay? So you practice infection control, which is universal precautions. You don't touch saliva, you don't touch any kind of body fluid unless you wear gloves. Why do you do that? Because you don't know how the infectious state of the individual, so you just assume everyone is infectious. That has decreased the infection rate in this country significantly. So when we're talking about universal precautions for trauma, it's really a public health model of just assume the people you encounter have history of trauma, therefore you run a trauma-informed system of care. The second statistic that's really significant here is that in the general population, 61% of men and 51% of women may have some traumatic experience. So folks, statistically, half of the people in this room may have history of trauma. Statistically, that's half of your workforce may have history of trauma. So when we're talking about trauma-informed care, we're not just talking about the people we serve. We're talking about us. We're talking about the people working in these programs we're in. How many of you have ever watched a staff member and a client interacting, and you watched sparks fly? You've seen this, right? Let's take that through a trauma lens. If what makes an event traumatic is that it completely overwhelms the person's ability to cope, what do you think would be one of the more common triggers for individuals with trauma? It's a question. What? Yelling? Yelling, okay. What? Power struggle? Yes. Loss of control. If someone does not have control over what's going on, it brings back the same feeling of loss of control over that traumatic event, right? So now, imagine a staff member who may have history of trauma says to a client, I need you to do this, and the client may have history of trauma. Client says no. That's why you watch sparks fly. They will go at it until someone wins because they don't want to re-experience that feeling of loss of control. So that's not a bad staff member. That's just a staff member trying to manage her or his own emotional state. So if we understand that our staff have history of trauma, there are many different strategies we begin to look at. For example, in some programs we've worked with, behind the staff IDs, the staff have identified their own triggers. Think about that. My trigger is when someone makes fun of my accent. Something just goes off in my head that says that person just called you stupid. It's a trigger. So when I used to work on the floors, and I worked a lot in youth programs, and I give an adolescent, a youth, a directive, and that person says, heck no, why should I follow you? You can't even speak English. The next thing I hear is, roll to the nursing station. My coworkers knew what my trigger was. But imagine a workplace where you know each other's triggers, so you can tap each other on the shoulder to say, let me take over. The problem with most human service systems is that we're expected to get along with 100% of our clients, be objective 100% of the time, empathic 100% of the time, and it's not possible. There are people who get under our skin. So when we're talking about trauma-informed care and understanding we're humans who may have our own triggers, imagine a workplace where you understand that and you can help each other. A workplace that provides space for a therapist to say, can you please see me so-and-so today? I just had a fight with my husband today and I cannot see her today, and that's okay. That's trauma-informed. It's understanding we're human. It's understanding we have our own triggers and that we have a responsibility to prevent acting on those triggers. I was called to a program in the Northeast, the program had very high use of seclusion and restraints. I got there, and it was a youth program, and it was, oh my God, there really was very high use of seclusion and restraints. But there was one program that had lower use, so I said, take me to that program. Got there, pulled the mental health counselor and asked the mental health counselor, what do you do different in this program? Why you have lower violence rates? And he said, Raul, we learned something very simple. He said, after we give a child a directive, we walk away. By not standing there and imposing their will on that child, that's trauma-informed. That child does not have to fight. Of course, I was skeptical. I'm like, oh, there's got to be a second part to this. How could you reduce violence by 50% just by walking away? Said, yes, the second part of this is we take what we can get. I said, okay, explain that to me. And this is a pretty common scenario. Group is going on in the group room. He's monitoring the hallway. Someone is disruptive in group. That person gets sent out to the hallway. And eventually he'll say, why don't you take a time out in your room, and when you're calmer, you can rejoin group. And he walks away. I said, inevitably, he will watch that person put his back against the wall in the hallway and sit in the hallway. And he said, I take what I can get. That's what he's giving me. And the goal is to calm down, not to go to the room. But think about how many of our power struggles in our programs has to do with we lose sight of that and it becomes about going to the room. That's trauma-informed. That's beginning to understand what it is we're trying to accomplish. Quick one, this is Hoda's psychiatrist wrote a paper that talked about the basic psychological motive for violent behavior is really toward feelings of shame and humiliation. The reason I put this up is for you to really look at, in your programs, what are practices that may cause shame and humiliation. When you're talking about trauma-informed, something very easy to do. Do I walk into your program and your signs say, do not, do not, do not, do not, everything I cannot do in your program? Or does it say welcome? Simple. But you think of all of those practices that cause shame and humiliation and how triggering those can be. One of my favorites, staff bathroom. Bathroom, staff only. Why? Are our clients not good enough to use our toilets? Think of the feelings of shame and humiliation in signage and in different ways in different programs. So when we're talking about a trauma-sensitive or trauma-focused program, that's a program that does trauma assessment screening and possibly treatment. Trauma-informed care, as I said, is practicing universal precautions. And a trauma-informed system of care is one where we understand that there's trauma in the people we serve and trauma in the staff and the community, and that the whole system of care is steeped in partnerships and collaboration so that people may have hope, people may heal, and people may recover. Now, one of the things, and we'll talk a little bit about this later on, part of the reason why I created this schematic is also in terms of a trauma-informed system of care. In terms of organizational trauma, this is a good schematic to plug all the initiatives that you have in different programs, because if it cannot fit here, that's just stress in an organization. That's just a flavor of the month. Because organizations get stressed if people get new initiatives and they don't understand what that's going to make a difference in their lives. How many of you are, because work doesn't stop, training for the sake of training, like being here, is stressful. How many of you are sitting here thinking, I wonder how many emails are waiting for me? So if you don't understand why this training would make a difference in your work and in your life, this is just stress. So that it's really helpful in this schematic to understand whatever you do in any program is to be able to plug it in and see how it all connects as part of organizational stress. How many of you have heard of the ACE study? Oh, cool. Oh, wow. Very nice. How many of you are using the ACE Questionnaire in your programs? None? Okay. So we'll talk a little bit about the ACE study. Dr. Felitti is an internist that is working out of Kaiser Permanente in La Jolla. And he was running, several years ago, a weight loss program. And noticed that in his weight loss program, some people are graduating after having lost weight and immediately regain the weight back, or are losing weight within the program but dropping out. So he couldn't figure out what's going on. So he dug deeper and discovered that what was common in all of these individuals was a history of adverse childhood experiences, childhood trauma. That's what the ACE stands for. It's a study of adverse childhood experiences. But understand that it's not a childhood study. It's the study of the effect of childhood trauma later in life, in adulthood. And we'll go through this pretty quickly, but I want you to think about what this all means. So they were able to use 17,000 individuals as part of this study. So this is not a small study. And it got picked up by the Center for Disease Control because the Center for Disease Control understood that this has significant implications for mortality and morbidity of American people. So one thing I would encourage you to do, I'll go through the ACE questionnaire, is to score yourself. Here's the ACE questionnaire. While you were growing up during the first 18 years of life, 1, did a parent or other adult in the household often or very often swear at you, insult you, put you down, or humiliate you, or act in a way that made you afraid that you might be physically hurt? 2, get pushed, grabbed, slapped, or thrown something at you, or ever hit you so hard that you had marks or were injured? 3, did an adult or person at least 5 years older touch or fondle you or have you touch their body in a sexual way, or attempt or actually have oral, anal, or vaginal intercourse with you? 4, no one in your family loved you or thought you were important or special, or your family didn't look out for each other, feel close to each other, or support each other. 5, you didn't have enough to eat, had to wear dirty clothes, had no one to protect you, or your parents were too drunk or high to take care of you or to take you to the doctor if you needed it. So those first questions are your typical physical, emotional abuse, neglect issues. The other thing they found is that family dysfunction has as much effect later in life as those traditional traumas that we're familiar with. So by number 6, were your parents ever separated or divorced? Was your mother or stepmother often or very often pushed, grabbed, slapped, or had something thrown at her, or sometimes often or very often kicked, bit, and hit with a fist, or hit with something hard, or ever repeatedly hit at least a few minutes or threatened with a gun or knife? 8, did you live with anyone who was a problem drinker or alcoholic or who used street drugs? 9, was a household member depressed or mentally ill, or did a household member attempt suicide? And 10, did a household member go to prison? So as you see, you can get anywhere from a 0 to 10 in your score. And as you see, it's not that hard to get a 1 or a 2 for the general population. So the ACE, so some uses, the reason I ask, for example, we now have drug courts we're working with that the ACE questionnaire gets administered to, so that they begin to understand what's the amount of trauma. We have some residential programs where this gets administered to staff on orientation. They don't get for the results back. They don't ask for the results back, but it's a way to get staff to understand you're bringing in issues and how you work in this program is affected by that. So many different use of the ACE questionnaires. So let's go through some of the findings here. Emotional problems. The higher the ACE questionnaire, the higher the percent of lifetime history of depression. The higher the ACE, the higher the percent of attempted suicide. Actually, a person with a score of 4 is 10 times more likely to attempt suicide than a person with a score of 0. The higher the ACE, the higher the percent of individuals who report hallucinations. There are actually more, and Kate talked about this, there are studies coming out that hallucinations are actually believed to be garbled flashbacks. The higher the ACE, the higher the percent of individuals with impaired childhood memory. So those are some of the emotional findings. Some of the health risk behaviors that have been found. The higher the ACE score, the higher the likelihood of smoking. This is why the Center for Disease Control picked this up, because they said, oh my God, you mean to say if I know the person's ACE score, I can predict the likelihood of smoking, I can predict the likelihood of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, I can predict lung cancer, I can predict early death. The higher the ACE score, the higher the likelihood of becoming an adult alcoholic. The higher the ACE score, the higher the likelihood of being an IV drug abuser. This is an interpretation of the graph for the IV drug use. A male child with an ACE score of 6 is 4,600% more likely to become an IV drug user. 4,600%. Do you think the odds are stacked against that child? That's why Felitti asks the question, could it be that drugs are used for the relief of profound anguish dating back to childhood, and it could be the best coping device that individual can find? Is drug abuse really self-destructive, or is it really an attempt at self-healing? Serious social problems. The higher the ACE score, the higher the percent of individuals reporting being victims of rape. One of the things that we have learned, if we go back to the example, to the scenario I asked you to think about, if you think about that child growing up in a household where their protector is also their abuser, they may not develop the red flags, the warning signs of danger. How can they? If the person protecting you is also the person abusing you. So that individuals, and we use this a lot, with emergency room nurses. They are notorious for saying, wasn't she here 6 months ago claiming rape and she's here again? Those may be individuals that are in situations where you and I are already running, but may not have the red flags, and they're still there. The higher the ACE score, the higher the likelihood of more than 50 sexual partners. The higher the ACE score, the higher the likelihood of sexually transmitted diseases. The higher the ACE score, the higher the likelihood of unintended pregnancy or abortion. One of the correlates, and you saw this question around watching someone being grabbed, slapped, pushed, or shoved. And one of the correlates is whether that you watch someone or that happened to you. The higher the ACE score of watching someone being pushed, shoved, slapped, or yourself being pushed, shoved, or slapped, the higher the likelihood of becoming pregnant as a teenager. Direct correlation. The other interesting data in this is that the younger the sexual abuse of a child, of a male child, the younger the sexual abuse occurs, the higher the likelihood of that male child impregnating a teenage girl. Think of all of the social issues that come out of this. A male child who is sexually abused under the age of 10 is 80% more likely to impregnate a teenage girl than a male child with 0. Other correlates for this. The higher the ACE score for women, the higher the likelihood of being a victim of domestic abuse. The higher the ACE score for both men and women, the higher the ACE score, the higher the likelihood of being perpetrators of domestic abuse. Lifespan, there's about a 20%, there's about a 10-year difference in the lifespan of an individual with an ACE score of 4 and an individual with an ACE score of 0. That's early death. So basically, the whole conceptual framework that the ACE score provides us is to understand that there's a reason for many of the things we see. Has anyone here never had a bad day at work? Okay, we've all had one of those, okay. So what do you guys do to de-stress after a difficult day at work? What are some of the things that strategies that work for you guys? Yes? Gardening, okay. Oh, that's right, G-rated only. Okay. What else? Hot bath? Hot bath? Okay. Play with the dog. A what? Watch a sitcom. Glass of wine, a woman after my own heart. Prayer? Exercise. Okay. So the point is we all do something different to manage our stress, right? I eat a bag of potato chips. But on certain days, that has to come with a glass of wine. Or two. Because whatever we use every day may not necessarily be sufficient for those really more difficult days, right? But the whole point is that when we begin to understand that someone walking the dog, someone praying, someone exercising, my bag of potato chips is really the next person's alcohol, the next person's crystal meth, the next person's cutting. We're all just trying to survive in this world. And when we begin to view symptoms as adaptations, it's attempts at managing the world, we begin to shift our thinking and we begin to view the people we serve from a different lens. And that's what trauma-informed care is. We begin to understand symptoms as adaptations. It's attempts at managing the world. We have a program in Missouri that we're working with. It's a maximum security program for individuals with intellectual disability that are highly violent. But in that program, for the staff to work in that program, they have to sign a contract. And the contract states, for me to work in this program, I believe that every hour of each day, the people in this program are just trying to do their best. Think about that. Think about what your program may feel and look like if everyone in your program understood that symptoms are adaptations and folks are just trying to do their best. Oh, here's one that's administrators. The higher the ACE score, the higher the percent, the higher people have impaired worker performance. Think about this for the workforce. Absenteeism, financial problems, and serious job problems. So what we're really talking about, symptoms as adaptations, okay? So two things that I want to leave you with is understand that all behavior has meaning and symptoms as adaptations. How many of you work in 24-hour programs, like inpatient or residential? Okay, I'll pick on you. But this is what happens. Okay, so I get admitted, for example, let's take an inpatient program. I get admitted to an inpatient program. When I get there, they basically say to me, Raul, in this program, you cannot smoke, you cannot drink, you cannot have drugs, you cannot have sex, your cholesterol is too high, you cannot have your bag of potato chips. But we expect you to behave as an angel. We take away everything people use to manage the world when they come into our programs and wonder why they're agitated. So when we're talking about trauma-informed care, we begin to understand people will do what they need to do to manage the world until we can help them with new strategies. That's why the Just Say No program didn't work.